Welcome to stage 4 of this demo series, and in this stage of the demo series you have access to temporary AWS credentials. So what we're going to do in this stage is configure the HTML and JavaScript which are stored within the application bucket, and we're going to add the necessary configuration so that this JavaScript, when running within our web browser, is able to access AWS resources. So we're going to edit the HTML and the JavaScript so that they're able to interact with the Google Identity Provider, the Cognito Identity Pool, and then finally using those temporary credentials to interact with the private patches bucket. So once this stage is over, you're going to have a fully functional web application which uses Web Identity Federation. Now let's get started configuring this, and to do that we need to move across to the AWS console. So we're going to be updating the files which represent our serverless applications, so the index.html and the scripts.js, and we'll find those in the S3 console. So move across to S3. You need to locate the WEBIDF-App bucket and move into this, and inside this bucket we have the two objects. We have index.html and we have scripts.js, and we need to download both of those to our local system. So select index.html and then click on download, and you'll need to save that to your local machine. Once you've done that, do the same for scripts.js, so select it, click on download, and again save this to your local machine. Now once both of those have downloaded, go ahead and open them in a text editor. So now we have open index.html and scripts.js. The index.html is the web page that's loaded when you open the serverless application, and it's also the thing which calls any of the functions contained inside scripts.js, and this is the JavaScript which runs in your browser and interacts with the Google Identity Provider as well as AWS. Now the first thing that we need to do is to update this HTML file, and we have one placeholder that we need to change. We need to specify the Google sign-in client ID. So this is this long string, and you should have noted down your Google client ID when you created the credentials in the second stage of this demo series. So go ahead and copy down your Google client ID and replace this placeholder. So in my case, this is how mine looks, and yours should look similar, just with a unique part at the start of this client ID. So once you've updated that, go ahead and save this file, and this just means that the HTML contains the data that can be used to communicate with the Google Identity Provider. Now we need to replace some placeholders in the scripts.js file, but it's useful at this stage just to understand how this HTML works. When the page is loaded, there's a button which is displayed which redirects through to the Google Identity Provider. So when you click on this button, the page changes through to the Google IDP, you perform an authentication operation, and then the Google Authentication token is returned. Now I'll talk about the code which allows this to happen in a second, but in addition to this, we've defined two areas of the page, viewer and output. And these areas of the page can be interacted with by the JavaScript, so we can change the contents of both of these areas, and it's these areas that our code will use to interact with the user. Now moving over to this, what happens when we click the sign in button is that we're prompted to sign in using the Google Identity Provider, and if that's successful, what we get back in return is a Google Identity token. So this is important. We get back proof that our user has logged in using the Google Identity Provider. Now what happens next is we take that identity token from Google and we use it to call Cognito. We provide Cognito with that identity token as well as the identity pool ID. And using both of these pieces of information, Cognito exchanges this authentication token for valid AWS credentials. So at this point we have valid AWS credentials which have been returned by Cognito, and these are stored in the aws.config.credentials. So now we've got the ability to interact with AWS. We run this access images function, and this is the function that connects to the S3 bucket and it uses those credentials. The first thing it does is to make a connection with S3 specifically to a particular S3 bucket, and this is one of the placeholders that we need to change. Then it does a list objects on that S3 bucket, and then for all of the objects in that S3 bucket, it generates a pre-signed URL using that object as well as the credentials that Cognito provided. And so the output of this is it will display any of the objects contained within that S3 bucket, even though they're entirely private. And it does this using the temporary credentials provided by Cognito when we swap the Google Auth token for these valid credentials. So we need to go ahead and replace these placeholders within scripts.js, and I've highlighted where you need to do the replace. So the first one is you need to replace the identity pool ID with your specific Cognito identity pool, and you should have noted this value down earlier in the demo series. Once you've done that, scroll down a little bit further and you'll need to replace this bucket placeholder with the bucket name of the private S3 bucket. So to get this, move back to the AWS console and then go to the main S3 console. Click on the private bucket, so that's the one that contains Patch's private bucket. And then just go ahead and copy down the full bucket name from the top of the screen. So copy that into your clipboard, move back to the scripts.js file and make sure you've got this entire placeholder selected between the speech marks and just paste in your specific bucket name. Now this will be unique to you because this is one of the ones that was generated by CloudFormation. Now we're just going to scroll through, make sure that all of the other placeholders are correct. We only have those two, so the bucket name and then the identity pool. And once you've done both of these inside scripts.js, then just go ahead and save that file. Make sure that you've also saved index.html and then move back to the AWS console. We need to be at the main S3 console, and then we need to enter the app bucket, and we're going to upload these updated files back into the application bucket. So click on upload, and then click on Add Files, select those two files that you've just edited, then click on Open, and then once they're populated in this list, go ahead and click on Upload. Now once that's done, we're ready to access our web application. Now we need to access this via CloudFront. So I want you to go ahead and open the CloudFront console. You might still have a tab open to this. If you don't, just search for it in the search bar at the top and then open that in a new tab. Once you're at the CloudFront console, just go into the distribution and copy down the distribution domain name into your clipboard. This is the address that you're going to need to access the web application. So once you've got that, go ahead and open that in a brand new tab. Then what I want you to do is to open your browser console. Now the way that this works depends on the browser. In Firefox, you'll need to click on Tools and then Browser Tools and then Web Developer Tools. Once you open that, make sure Console is selected, and this will allow you to see exactly what the browser does, so what the output from the JavaScript is. You can see at the moment that in my case it's blank, but once I start interacting with the application, you'll see exactly what happens. Now getting to the browser console can depend on the browser that you're using. In some cases you have to right click and go to console, in some cases it's inside a developer tools menu. In the case of Safari on macOS, you need to go into preferences and enable the develop menu. And once in there, you can access the browser console. In any case, you need to have your browser console open before we continue. Now what happens next depends on whether you're logged in to your Google identity or not, because if you are logged in, then it will use single sign-on. In my case, I'm not currently signed in with my Google ID, and so all I see is a sign in with Google button. Now when I click this sign in button, a number of things are going to happen. First, I'm going to be prompted to log in to the Google Identity Provider. So this web application has been configured when I click this button to move to the Google ID provider. Now, if you're already using a Google account, then it can suggest your existing credentials. In this case, this is the Google account which I've used earlier to generate the API credentials. And so I'm already logged in. My browser session knows that this account exists. And so instead of being prompted for a username and password, it can reuse this existing login session. If I wasn't logged in using this session, then I would be prompted for a username, a password, and optionally, if configured, an MFA. But in either of those cases, if I do this process, if I authenticate, then what I'm going to get in return is a Google Authentication token. This IDP is then going to move me back to my application, and the application is then going to proceed to exchange this Google Authentication token for temporary AWS credentials using Cognito. And what you're going to see in the browser console is this process occurring in real time. So you'll be able to see some information that's decoded from the Google Authentication token. You'll notice a status message saying that it's exchanging that Google token for AWS credentials. Once that token has been exchanged, then a session is created to S3 using these temporary credentials. Then it lists any of the objects inside the private patches bucket. It uses that object listing to generate a set of pre-signed URL operations against S3. So it generates pre-signed URLs for each of those objects. And then that HTML is returned to the browser, and the browser renders those pre-signed URLs. So what you'll see start appearing are any of the images inside the patches private bucket. In this case, we have 3. Now, if you click on any of these images, what you'll see is that the URL for these images, in addition to containing the DNS name for the patches private bucket and the object name, it's also got authentication information encoded in the URL. So it's a pre-signed URL, and that's how we're able to access this private bucket. Our web application is interacting with the AWS APIs using these temporary credentials, generating these pre-signed URLs, and it's these pre-signed URLs which allow us to access these private images. Now that's everything that I wanted you to do in this demo series. You've successfully implemented a simple serverless application. All that remains is to tidy up the account and remove all of the infrastructure that you've created. But that's something that we're going to do in stage 5 of this demo series. So at this point, go ahead and complete this video, and when you're ready, I'll look forward to you joining me in stage 5, where we'll perform account cleanup.